Sounds good.
Hello, Alex. I'm honored to call you a friend, and I'm honored to call you Alex. But the truth is that you are Dr. Herrera. And why do I say that? You have made so much effort in clinical trials that you've been associated with in terms of enrollment of all people. At ASH this past year, you gave a presentation on polatuzumab with RICE chemotherapy for patients with relapsed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And I don't need to tell you what the enrollment was, but that had almost a 40% minority enrollment. But as though you couldn't top that anymore, at the American Society of Clinical Oncology, your presentation to me was the most inspiring. You gave a presentation on a study with nivolumab with AVD chemotherapy versus BV-AVD chemotherapy, which showed superiority in terms of progression-free survival. But more importantly to me was that study was so representative of all people. 12% African-American enrollment, 13% Hispanic enrollment. So Alex, please tell us what's your secret.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I think intentionality about making sure that we are designing research studies, but including sites and investigators who are championing this idea that the research that we do must be representative of the patients that we serve. I think is really the key. With for research that we do at our center at City of Hope in the Los Angeles Center area, City of Hope serves a really diverse population in the Los Angeles County and the surrounding area. And I wish that we could do even better in terms of making sure that all patients in our area have access to the care that we provide. But I think we have many efforts to try to improve that. But once a patient is in the door, it's so important to offer clinical trials to them. It's an absolutely essential part of providing high quality cancer care. And I think we've managed to do a good job of that at our center, and I think we can do better. But to do it on a national scale, like you mentioned, with our SWOG S1826 trial in Hodgkin lymphoma, was just something that was so exciting to be able to see. Once, you never know how something's going to happen. There were hundreds of centers enrolling on this trial, and when we finally got the data that we had enrolled a quarter of patients were either Black or Latino, it was really exciting. But honestly, I think part of that was, we opened this trial in this big national clinical trials network, and we designed a pretty, a simple trial that really appealed to centers all around, of all types all around the country. So we had a huge amount of enrollment from the NCORP, like the community sites in the National Clinical Trials Network, and that was key. It was absolutely essential to having that representation. And so I think the more we can collaborate across the country, across the world, but among centers, academic centers in big cities, rural centers, community centers, I think the more we can design trials that all types of centers and investigators can participate in, I think the more likely we are to do research that's representative and applicable to everybody in our country and everybody globally.
Great. So I heard two things from you. One was that probably including centers that are normally not part of the enterprise of pharmaceutical companies when studies are done by pharmaceutical companies is key. The other thing I heard was what you referred to as intentionality, and I like that terminology. do you think that a study like this debunks the myth that minority patients are not interested in clinical trials, or do you think a study like this essentially reinforces the fact that if a minority person, or for that matter, anybody, feels comfortable with their care provider, trust their care provider, that if a clinical study was offered, that they will be interested? What do you think about that?
I think it's a crucial point. I think you're absolutely right. There is this myth that minority patients are not interested or don't want to participate in clinical research or are not good clinical research candidates. And I think this trial and hopefully others that we conduct can help us get away from that idea. There, look, I don't want to minimize the many barriers that exist, and many of them are historical and are related to mistrust. And I think there are some barriers that are many barriers that are important to be aware of. But again, I think you hit on the key. If a patient of any background trusts their team, and if they, if the team, if they're a patient who speaks a language other than English, but they have access to either somebody on the team who can speak their language, let's say Spanish, for example, or good quality information about the clinical trial in that language. If they trust the team and they are offered the trial, I think time and time again we see that patients that of any background are interested in participating in clinical research. So I think you're absolutely right. Whether this one trial debunks that myth, I wish it was true, but I think we still have a lot of work to do. But it takes one, there are so many steps that we have to take towards achieving these goals. And I think when we show that we can do it on a national stage, in a practice-changing trial like this, then I think it's a big statement. Now, you said something else that's really important that I wanted to kind of agree with, but also think about a little bit. When I was speaking at a meeting recently for the American Society of Gene and Cellular Therapy, and it was on DEI and kind of improving diversity in clinical trials. And it turned out unexpectedly that 95% of the audience was from industry, actually. And I think it struck me in that moment that really a huge part of changing how we do clinical trials, really a lot of the power resides in industry, right? In these biotech companies and in pharmaceutical companies that are largely conducting these trials. They, when we design clinical trials, when we think about reducing the burden of visits and changing eligibility criteria on clinical trials, pharma can really drive that. When we talk about an intentionality of investing in making sure that there are barriers like transportation or childcare and things like that don't continue to be barriers, pharma, I think, has the most agency and ability to change that. And so it's both the sites that they choose to engage with, but also how they engage with centers who are providing these clinical trials to their patients. There has to be an investment and a real, this can't be simply checking a box. And I think we all have seen that. And I think it really has to be about, a real commitment to enrolling a diversity of patients. And I think we're starting to see improvements, but I think there's a lot of room to go.
Great points. Before I sort of, push you a little further, I know Maya had a question for you. So Maya, what were you thinking as you were looking at the data and sort of thinking about what Dr. Herrera was saying?
Yes, so one of my major questions, and a lot of the way that I look at things in relation to DEIA is introducing these concepts and this intentionality, excuse me, to a younger generation, especially my peers. I'm trying to go into medicine, and I recognize that some institutions are doing a better job than others in terms of in including it in their curriculums and teaching students young. So my question was really, what advice do you have to aspiring physicians, inspiring researchers, and how they can, kind of hit the ground running with that intentionality instead of it being something perhaps that they kind of have to go back and learn later?
Oh, it's a great question. I think we hope that as over time, this is just part of this is just part of how we approach medicine from the beginning, right? Not just, okay, here's this problem. We don't have diverse, populations in our clinical trials. How can we go backwards, like you said? But the understanding from when you're early in your training, or even before that, right? The idea that, there has not been equality or equity in representation or in access to care or in access to clinical trials. That that understanding of that, and thinking of kind of just the awareness of that is like a crucial first step. And then I think that I hope, and I hope that in medical school curricula, we're talking about this. I mean, I think when years ago when I was going through my training, it wasn't necessarily a main focus. There was some initial understanding or insight into this, but I think a real understanding and acceptance of this as of something that we really have to tackle is step number one. I think, and because people, who are going through medical training may end up in all different diverse areas of medicine. They could be providers, they can be researchers, they might go to industry, they might become a lawyer. You never know where people are going to end up. And I think having a cadre of, physicians or trained physicians who understand that will be important. Now, how do we really translate that? Are there concrete tools that trainees can take forward? And I think as we train our physicians, if we're thinking about health equity from kind of our fundamental, basic building blocks of biochemistry and anatomy, if we're really talking about it, then it becomes just second nature, right? Then if you become a clinical researcher, it's going to be obvious to you that we should be inclusive and that we should be providing, these cutting edge clinical trials to all patients. So again, I guess it comes down to education, intentionality of that education from early on in our training, because it's hard to predict where any one individual provider will end up in their career and what they'll be doing. But if the importance of diversity and of health equity is something that's a fundamental building block of their training, I think then whatever they do in their career, they'll be able to apply those lessons and kind of make change, if that makes sense.
Great, Alex. Go ahead, Maya.
Oh, I was just going to say it most certainly does. And to kind of go off of that, I do have a little bit of a follow-up question, but you kind of began to touch on what kinds of fundamentals would you think are some of those absolute building blocks of health equity?
Yeah, I mean, look, part of it is understanding the history of inequity. That's an obvious place to start. I think really understanding social determinants of health and all the different factors that like kind of the systemic factors that go into that have led to inequity, the history of how those things have occurred. And then I think, look, we have, we have really innovative medical school and training curricula, right? We think really innovatively about how to problem solve when it comes to a case of X, Y, or Z, like medical complication or medical problem. I think we can I think we should be doing that when it comes to health equity, right? We can think about system-wide, system issues, and maybe we can have cases, right, where we're in places where changes have been made and that have been successful. We can learn from those cases, right? We can think about how to address inequity, and build a kind of a toolkit for people to approach addressing inequities in different facets of what they do, whether that's health policy, clinical trials. There's all kinds of arenas where this is key. So I think understanding the history, the various factors that go into this, understanding kind of the data about kind of inequities in health, and the disparities in outcomes, and then thinking about understanding how we can research that, and what have there been cases of where we've been successful in addressing health inequities, or kind of almost like these case-based studies or problem-based learning that we have in our medical school curricula. I think we can be more innovative in how we approach teaching about this.
So, it is not a surprise that we're having this conversation today, the 19th of June of 2023. It's Juneteenth Day. The original sin of our country, as you know, was not addressing issues of equity at the very beginning. So we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their maker by setting inalienable rights, including the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, just to paraphrase. And the pursuit of life includes health equity. So how would you address the question of persons who might say, here we are, I'm African-American or Black, there's Maya, she's African-American or Black, you're Hispanic American, you had the opportunity of attending, one of the best medical schools in the country, Harvard Medical School. And here you are talking about why is it important to have the equity in clinical research? How do you address that?
It's when we have opportunities in life, it's these opportunities come, and change doesn't happen necessarily. Change doesn't just happen, right? You have to take those opportunities and really kind of, just to bring it back to intentionality, you have to be intentional about what you do, how you deliver on those opportunities. And it's simple enough to be able to have this opportunity, let's say, to lead a randomized phase 3 trial in Hodgkin lymphoma. It's another thing to be intentional and say, look, we're going to be inclusive. We're going to include pediatric patients. We're going to include older adults. We're going to include, we're going to make a real effort to enroll a broad population of diverse patients. I think many people, and I wouldn't fault them for it, might just say, I'm really excited to have this opportunity, and I want to enroll a clinical trial and try to change the face of how we treat Hodgkin lymphoma. But it takes care and intentionality to try to do it in a way that can not just improve the care for some patients, and to think about, well, let's this is going to be great for my career, or this is going to be great for the field, or whatever it is. I think it's having that holistic view, is important, but it's hard. It's hard because there are a lot of competing factors that go into doing clinical research, as you know, and trying to kind of keep that compass pointed in the right direction to make sure that when we have these opportunities, we have the opportunity to stand on that stage. I could have presented those data and just shown the baseline characteristics and left it at that.
Yes.
And let the data speak for itself.
Typically what we see. That's what we see normally.
That is usually what we see. And frankly, actually, what we usually see is that the studies aren't representative. But even when they're there, I think it's really important to, when we have that 10 minutes of opportunity and with people listening, to make that point to, on the big stage, I think is really important. Again, it speaks to just being intentional about what we're doing. And it takes some, it takes bravery sometimes, or it takes a little bit of extra effort. But a little bit of extra effort can go a really long way. And I think people actually were really receptive, received that well. I think people were excited to see that it's possible. And people, we always feel like, oh, if I change my one clinical trial, how am I going to make a difference in this huge field? How am I going to, if I pay for patients' transportation for these extra visits, clinical trial visits, how is that one trial going to change everything? But we can, but we can, little by little, make these changes. But I hope I answered your question. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you did. So you answered the question in a number of ways. First of all, you were being your modest self by not acknowledging the fact that it takes a special person. It takes a special person like you to feel that there is a purpose beyond your career. It takes a special person to feel that there is a reason why this matters. And when I came up to the back of the stage and gave you a hug, that was the point that I wanted to make. But beyond that, there is also the element of having diverse investigators leading studies, because then you do not hear just one voice. Your voice being heard was not because you were Hispanic. Your voice being heard was because you are a world-class investigator who happened to be Hispanic. And that cannot be lost on all of us. And for that, I must say thank you. But beyond that also, I thought that our society, the American Society of Clinical Oncology and the American Society of Hematology, they had a lot of honorific awards that they give every year. I think one thing that is missing is a recognition of investigators who present the most diverse study at a national meeting. I think there ought to be an honorific award of that. And if there was one, you would have won it. So today, I am offering you an honorific award of the best and the most diverse investigator at the study presenter at the American Society of Clinical Oncology meeting this past June. Hopefully, the leadership of ASH and ASCO will hear this and create a true honorific award recognizing this, because we can speak to it just very momentarily or very briefly, but I don't know that that does enough justice to it. But that's me, sort of going off on an editorial rant. But no, this is about you.
It's actually a nice. I think it's a nice, really valid and a nice idea, right? So I think ASH has made strides in thinking about diversity and trying to, I think there's an honorific award now dedicated to, to kind of mentorship, diversity and mentorship and different, they're trying to address this in different ways. But really, what a lot of what we do, like the fundamentals of what we do, is doing research, right? And to have an award or some recognition of diversity, kind of conducting research that that is serving diverse population is actually a really nice idea, and something that I will do my best to bring to folks who think about this.
Thank you. And then as we begin to wrap up, what additional words of wisdom do you have for the investigators who are leading clinical trials that they should think of and incorporate into their strategy as leaders in our space?
Well, I think I guess the theme of what we've been talking about is really being intentional about this and about improving the diversity of our clinical trial populations. And there are a lot of ways to do that. I think it starts by, kind of building trust and relationships with your patients to allow them to feel comfortable to participate in trials and overcome, kind of mistrust and other historical barriers to participation in research. But I think, I think overcoming our own provider bias about who's a clinical trial candidate, or, I think we have to offering patients clinical research and clinical trials is a fundamental part of excellent cancer care. So I think if you're not doing that, if a patient might live 3 hours away, they might have 3 jobs, they might have, whatever the case may be, you let them decide, right? You say, this is a clinical trial, I think that makes sense for you, and you let them decide. Now, it would be helpful if we also built in, transportation support and all these different ways that we can help patients overcome some of the logistical barriers that we think about as clinical trial candidacy. But so I think trying to make clinical trials less burdensome, right? Do you really need every single, X on that study calendar? Did you really need the patient to come back on day 5 for, whatever lab test? Try to be efficient with patients' time. And I think you will see that patients, when you're explaining a clinical trial to a patient, they're much more likely to participate if we've reduced the burden. But most importantly, I think we often systematically exclude patients of diverse backgrounds from clinical trials because we make our eligibility criteria overly strict, or and we exclude patients with hemoglobin A1C of X value, or a creatinine clearance of X value. And we know that historically, patients from Black or Hispanic patients, because of the health inequity that has existed for so long, are much more likely to be excluded from clinical trials because they're much more likely to have, whether it's hypertension or chronic kidney disease, all these different factors that when we try to have the ideal clinical trial patient, we end up excluding, we end up narrowing down the population, pretty demographically. So I think honestly, it just requires intention. Having that intention as a starting point is the first step to change. And I hope, and I think we all can play a part in educating the younger generation about having that intentionality and to be thinking about these issues from the beginning. And I think in 10 or 20 years, I'm hopeful that this is like the baseline. This is how we do clinical research. We're thinking about these things. It's to not do them would be wrong, right? Or we wouldn't be conducting clinical research. It's not just, how do you design a clinical trial and make sure that it's a statistically valid, question that you're asking, et cetera. Oh no, I mean, a fundamental part of that is having a representative population. So I think once we can get to that, I think we can get to that point with continued effort and intention.
Thank you so much. Maya, do you have any last questions for Dr. Herrera?
No, I don't think so. I've, been taking notes throughout, but I also would like to thank you for being with us today and being as insightful as you are.
And thank you so much for all of you who are listening. You have been listening to Dr. Alex Herrera, who is Associate Professor at the City of Hope Cancer Center in Los Angeles, or Duarte, California, to be more specific, who recently presented data at the American Society of Clinical Oncology at the plenary session, presenting his work with others on the SWOG 1836 trial. We showed an improvement in outcomes with the combination of nivolumab and AVD chemotherapy with a 62% improvement in progression-free survival, about a 12% absolute difference in terms of PFS between the patients who were treated with NAVD versus BVAVD chemotherapy for patients as young as 12 years to as old as, I can't remember the oldest patient on the trial, but as old as they could be. And with 25% of the patients being minority patients, it can be done. And you just heard it from Dr. Herrera. So it is an honor on this June 10th to have you discuss with us on intentionality, how intentionality can make a significant difference in the outcomes of mine and your patients. So thank you so much,